So, 日本語を話すのは難しいかな? Nah, I probably fucked that all up. But language is the reason for the lack of content. And this goes and ties into that language inhibits the personality, or rather the exuding of personality when it comes to import players. And we're talking, more specifically like Korean players, or even Chinese players maybe in the future, or well, I guess we have sword art too. Although, wait, I think LMS, right? But this essentially limits the ability to create conversation with this player because they understand a limited amount of knowledge of English itself, which will then, from the content creator's perspective, or interviewer or journalist, if you want to call them that, it limits their ability to maybe say whatever that they want to say, or communicate what they want to say, or relay it to that person in such a way to where that they have a full-fledged conversation as such. And I don't think that's very outlandish, but as such, with the idea of limiting conversation, on top of that too, I think maybe some interviewers might also limit themselves in terms of how they speak. And I noticed this with a lot of people that maybe don't have experience, a lot of multicultural experience, and the fact that they equate the equivocal skills of listening versus speaking, because they aren't actually equivocal. They're very different, in fact, when it works within the brain. And I'll get into that entire aspect in a minute later. But you'll notice that some of these people, they will end up speaking in broken English to someone who doesn't speak good English. And it's because they think that the listening is also equates to the ability to speak, and they draw those two parallels, which is not the case. And so they themselves sound very stupid to the person that they're trying to communicate to, as well as them just not conveying their point clearly at all, in fact. And so, with that said, I want to draw on the idea of the content creator aspect or interviewer aspect, and how many times people that don't speak that great of English have been interviewed. So I've actually counted the number of times I've interviewed a Korean player. Like, let's face it, it's mostly Korean players that we're talking about here, who have poor English skills. Like, and this is not talking about, someone like Huhi or Huni even, or Reapered or something. It's, generally poorer English skills. I've interviewed 0 of them in video format. And the reason for that being is that whenever I do interview someone, at least I think it's 0. Whenever I do interview someone that has, less than like a high level English language capability, at least in speaking, is that I'll just transcribe the video or the audio, in fact, and do it in a written format. I'll create an article with that player. Now, you look at, say, for instance, Travis Gafford, right? And how many times he's interviewed Korean players with poor English in LCS. And this is not counting Worlds, because at Worlds, you get a actual translator, which then is on video or whatever. So that doesn't count. He has interviewed a very limited number of players, in fact, and usually it's because of the initial hype whenever they come into the league or whatnot. He'll do an interview with them, but then he won't do an interview later on. Now, with that, you think of just the idea of the video interview. Now, obviously, Travis is the other person that does video interviews. I'm the other person that does video interviews. And I think there's only one other person that does it, which is Digon, in fact. So there aren't a whole lot of video interviewers within the LCS. And you think of just the video format specifically, and the best attributes or the best qualities that you can take away from it, which is that it exudes personality. Because it's very difficult to embody personality within the written format in terms of just the nuance of a person's character, because a lot of things are lost when you go to the written format, which is why I think they serve two different purposes. You can't just go in full blooded and say that you want to do this specific piece only in written format or only in video format or whatnot. They serve different types of purposes, and I think depending on the type of content that you want to produce, it produces. You have two different ways of producing it, either a written or a video format, if it's in your skill repertoire, and then you can decide from there which is the better format, if you're skilled enough, as I said. And so with that, like for instance, famously, what's hard to translate into written format is sarcasm. Sarcasm is incredibly difficult to translate into written format, which is why maybe there's so much misunderstanding on platforms like Twitter or Facebook or whatnot, because they're all a written format essentially. So with that said, there is a very limited number of opportunities in order to express your personality within the video format. And so far, two of the big video interviewers, I guess I wouldn't call myself big, but one of the only video interviewers in the LCS don't do a whole lot of like foreign Korean player interviews. And I think this is part of the problem. You look at podcasts. Podcasts also don't interview a lot of Korean players or players that don't have that great of English. And you could see this as a continuing trend, and it's because they think that it's not going to be a great podcast or a great interview because the language barrier is somewhat there, right? It's somewhat strong there. And so with that said, I want to go into a story that I had an interaction at the press booth, when we could go into the press booth way back when, with Loco Doco. Now, me and Loco Doco, we were like chilling in the press room or whatnot, and it was like he was about to interview Rush, or maybe I was, one of the two, the famous Cloud9 jungler, right? At least back in the day. Or maybe it was Echo Fox that he was on at the time. And I had asked Loco Doco, I was like, yo, so I want to actually know, because Rush, he speaks very good English. No one has any problem understanding him. He speaks really fucking good English. But with that said, he speaks very aloof. He is very comical, very goofy, right? Very fun and go lucky. But how is he like when he speaks in Korean? And this is like a different iteration of a question that I like to ask some people, which is, what language do you think in? And that question is very, I guess, peculiar for me, because it lets me into maybe the mind space of someone that, if they're bilingual or trilingual or whatever, it's how comfortable is that person in whatever language, right? And it's probably alluding to English, right? So if you actually are able to think in English, that means you're incredibly fucking comfortable with English. I've spoken with some people and I've asked that question before, and oftentimes they're just like, wow, that's a crazy question. But actually, I think in English, for the most part, unless I'm speaking, another language or whatnot momentarily, then maybe I'll switch to that in my thought process. But for the most part, it's English, and it's probably because they're surrounded with a lot of English speakers and they have to speak it constantly. So with that said, the whole Rush story, that's very interesting in the fact that when you hang out in the press booth, oftentimes a lot of other journalists or interviewers, whatever you want to call them, they'll ask, because after the game ends, oftentimes you would submit your request for a particular player or whatnot, and some press would ask, hey, how well does this player speak English? And people would comment in the press room like, oh, he speaks okay, or oh, he speaks really good English, like bang on. And the press person would then evaluate that situation and determine if they want to request that person or not. And initially, it sounds a little fucked up, and I can get that. But also, in the same vein, you have to think from the interviewer perspective of just maybe they want to have an in-depth conversation with that person, right? It's not. I know there's the cynical aspect of, well, maybe they're just trying to do this for clicks or for views or whatnot. And maybe that is the case for some people, but I think also it's just genuinely, at least from my perspective, that I would just rather have a very in-depth, sometimes philosophical conversation with a player. And I feel like that's going to be lost in translation. And oftentimes it is, in fact, when I interview these players. And so I want to jump to maybe an idea of basically an advantage that Invent Global specifically has, which is that since they're a translation outlet as well as an interviewing outlet, right? And that they can do both English and Korean, which is fantastic. And both of the translations match, because it's the same fucking people that are doing it, and they're really good at what they do, or at least I think they're good at what they do. I don't fucking speak Korean, even though I am Korean. But so with that said, they're in a very good position to convey some personality as such. But as I said before, the problem with Inven is that they don't do video interviews. So where are you going to get your personality feed when it comes to connecting with these players? Because the fans say that's why that they can't connect with some foreign players or import players, is because there's seemingly no way for them to tell their personality because it's very limited to that access. In fact, it's because it's mostly like team documentaries or whatever the fuck. And I just want to say that it's not the fault of the players themselves. Like, let's just get that out the way, because language is very, very difficult to learn, and especially as you grow older. But so I had studied Japanese for like 2 years, I want to say, like way back when. We're talking like probably like 10 years ago or something. And the problem is that it's way easier to understand a language, to listen to a language, rather than it is to speak a language. And this is because you have to formulate the sentence and the words yourself when you speak, versus when you listen, that person already did that process for you, right? They already came up with that. On top of that, they already came up with the sentence structure as well too. And if you know anything about like Japanese, in fact, and probably how I butchered the intro to this entire video, is that the way that you construct a sentence is very different, because the nouns and the verbs are placed at very different areas as English. For instance, the verb, it goes at the very end in Japanese, versus in English, it could kind of go anywhere, right? Like even that sentence that I just said, or even this sentence now, in fact, I could place the verb or running anywhere that I want, and it doesn't affect it, because that's just how the English structure works. You see what I'm talking about? So with that said, English is very difficult, language is very difficult, so shouldn't be any blame on the players. And I think one big thing that really kind of is unfortunate is the fact that LCS didn't take the opportunity to drive the personality aspect, or rather an avenue to express personality from these other players, is through the Scrum interviews. Originally, I did a video a while back when Travis also released a video about Scrum interviews and how he didn't like them and whatnot because of pre-submitted questions. And I agree with that. But also, it's the fact that Riot didn't use this opportunity to allow it as a translation event, to where import players can have more access, and they provide a translator in order to translate the responses or whatnot that maybe a Korean player would have that can't speak that great of English. And so there would be a deeper connection, and you could answer more antiquated questions, in fact, because oftentimes I like to preface my questions with something of a statement, of, the background of what I'm talking about, and then I will lead up into the question. When you're talking with maybe someone that doesn't understand English that well, then they might get lost in the entire context that you were talking about, and then you ask the question and they're like, well, what the fuck, what did you just say beforehand? Like, I lost entirely what you were talking about. And so I think LCS completely dropped the ball on that, in fact. But whole point of this entire thing is that I think, me myself, I've contributed to this entire death spiral of what it is to be a foreign player within the LCS, and the fact that you don't get many opportunities to express your personality because the video format, in fact, of interviews is very limited, and you yourself get limited on that format because of the content creators or the video interviews or the podcast, etc. And so it feeds back into this loop of just, okay, you are limited to maybe your tutor in speaking English, your team, and that entire bubble. But other than that, you don't have anyone else to interact with English. So you don't develop your skills of English, as it were, anyways. And so then that means that you don't have your personality out there, which then that means I'm less likely to interview you. And so it just spirals out of fucking control, and it's kind of shitty. And so that's why I had this kind of revelation, actually, Travis's Hotline League episode a little bit ago with Papa Smithy, and how fans were talking about how they couldn't connect with certain players and whatnot. And Someday actually came up, and I agree. I actually did an interview with Someday this season, and I transcribed that interview. And originally it was a video interview, but I transcribed it because of both brevity, so I could jot down exactly what he was talking about, eliminate the ums and the ahs and etc. But you also do lose part of the personality in that, in fact. And also, too, you do gain the benefit that maybe people that haven't grown up in that multicultural aspect as viewers or as fans, when they read the interview versus listen to the interview, maybe they might not understand what Someday is actually saying because they only grew up around people that speak English versus, like someone like me. I've grown up with a whole bunch of different languages that have surrounded me, like Tagalog, Korean, English, Spanish, like Japanese. I've grown up with a lot of different fucking, scenes and whatnot. So maybe I'm more equipped to understand someone that speaks a different language, even though, they're speaking in English or whatnot. So I just think, I had this epiphany. But with that said, I think I'm going to give some of these types of players more of a chance when it comes to video interview format, because also, too, if no other fucking video interviewer is doing these interviews, then obviously, like, you're going to have to come to my channel in order to consume that type of content. And hopefully that helps out the players, too, in fact, and that they get to express their personality more, and they maybe even get more comfortable with English. So yes, I think this has contributed to the entire gap in terms of fans not knowing the personality of players and such, is because they can't appear on podcasts or interviews and whatnot, because it's somewhat gated by the interviewer or the podcaster for decent reasons. In fact, I don't think it's very cynical at all, but I think this is part of the contributing factor.